All right, today we're diving into a really thought-provoking book called Arise Arjuna. It's written by David Frawley, who you might also know as Vamadeva Shastri. This book is essentially a powerful call to action for what he describes as a resurgent Hinduism for our times. And we're going to unpack its core arguments right now. So, the entire book really hinges on this one single powerful metaphor from the Mahabharata, the dejection of the warrior Arjuna. You might know the story. Right before the massive battle of Kurukshetra, Arjuna just freezes. He's paralyzed with doubt and despair, totally unwilling to fight his own family. Frawley takes this ancient dilemma and uses it to frame what he sees as a critical crisis happening today.
And this quote right here, this is central to the whole thing. Frawley is essentially arguing that modern India, and maybe more specifically the Hindu psyche, is standing on its own Kurukshetra. It's a moment of truth, a point where a really difficult, unavoidable choice has to be made about its identity and its future.
So how does the book actually frame this modern battle? Well, it starts by diagnosing a problem that Frawley says isn't external at all, but internal. He calls it a crisis of the psyche.
According to Frawley, the main conflict isn't on some physical battlefield. Nope. It's happening inside the minds of India's intellectual, political, and media establishment. He describes it as a deep internal conflict, going so far as to call it an inner civil war, where the country's elite is basically at war with its own cultural heritage.
And he uses some incredibly strong language to describe this. He argues this inner conflict boils over into what he calls a profound cultural self-hatred. He makes the bold claim that in probably no other country on earth does the educated class make a regular pastime of tearing down its own history and traditions.
The book then gets into the specifics. What are the symptoms of this psychological crisis? Well, Frawley points to a pattern of mocking the nation's past, an elite class that's totally disconnected from its own roots, and a political system driven by corruption and what he calls divisive vote bank politics. He's also very critical of an education system that he believes just copies foreign intellectual models, which ends up alienating students from their own heritage.
Okay, so if that's the diagnosis, what does the book say is the cause? Frawley argues this internal crisis is being fueled by an external battle, a battle over the story, over the narrative.
Frawley believes this self-negativity is constantly being fed and reinforced by how Hinduism and Indian history are portrayed, in the press and in academia. He argues that these narratives are often hostile, inaccurate, and only serve to make that internal alienation even worse. Now, to really drive his point home, Frawley dives into a detailed case study, the Ayodhya dispute, which all led up to the demolition in 1992. He uses this single event to show what he considers a profoundly biased narrative, and he asks, what does the story look like if we look at it through a completely different historical lens?
So, the book reframes the whole thing. It's not presented as just one single act of aggression in 1992. Instead, it's shown as the culmination of a struggle that lasted for almost 500 years. Frawley's account really emphasizes the site's original identity as a sacred Hindu temple, its demolition way back in 1528, the centuries of battles to reclaim it, and the fact that it was being used for Hindu worship for decades right up until 1992.
And this slide really gets to the heart of his argument. You've got the common media headline, Hindu militants destroy mosque. It's a simple, straightforward story of aggression, but Frawley's contextual narrative presents a much more complex picture. He frames it as Hindus demolish a disputed structure at a sacred Hindu site after centuries of conflict. For him, the huge difference between those two headlines is, well, it's everything.
This brings us to a really major section of the book, Frawley's direct rebuttal, of a term that was all over those headlines, the label Hindu fundamentalism. He basically argues that the term itself is just wrong.
So first, the book defines fundamentalism, but based on what Frawley sees as the core principles of exclusive belief-based religions. He outlines a very specific model, a rigid insistence on one God, one prophet, one literal holy book, and the idea that anyone who doesn't believe is condemned.
And then he takes this framework and applies it directly to Hinduism, going through that checklist one by one. One God? He argues Hinduism accepts countless divine forms. One holy book? Well, it has a massive library of sacred texts, not a single literal one. One final prophet? It honors a continuous line of sages and teachers. A missionary goal to convert the world? Not really part of the tradition. And a belief in eternal hell for non-believers? He contrasts that with the ideas of karma and reincarnation.
So based on that whole analysis, Frawley's conclusion is pretty blunt. The term Hindu fundamentalism is a misnomer. It just doesn't fit.
He argues it's an inaccurate label that's been imported from other religious contexts and then used as a political weapon to discredit any kind of Hindu cultural or political self-assertion. So, after diagnosing the problem and deconstructing the narratives around it, the final part of the book is a call to action. Frawley proposes a solution, and it's rooted in the very same metaphor he started with, a call for a dharmic resurgence.
He brings it all right back to Arjuna. The solution, he argues, isn't some political program. It's about cultivating a new Arjuna spirit, a psychological and spiritual shift to overcome that dejection and paralysis he described at the very beginning.
So, what exactly is this spirit? Well, Frawley describes it as having the courage to face today's intellectual battles without flinching. It's about being fearless in defending what he calls dharma, or righteousness, and having the sheer determination to see the nation realize its potential. And, maybe most importantly, it's about being willing to take a stand for what you believe is true, even if it feels like the whole world is against you. Frawley believes that if this Arjuna spirit is awakened in people, it will be the engine that powers the rise of what he calls a new Hinduism, one that's both deeply rooted in its ancient traditions, but also confident and ready for the modern world.
And his vision for this new Hinduism has a few key parts. First, rediscovering and actually taking pride in its own history. Second, a real commitment to internal reform, fixing social problems while holding on to the spiritual core. Third, embracing its universal teachings like yoga and Vedanta and sharing them with the whole world. And finally, the belief that India can become a kind of spiritual and ethical guide for all of humanity.
This quote right here really captures that ultimate goal presented in the book. It's a vision that goes way beyond India's borders, positioning it to play a spiritual role on the global stage, for the benefit of everyone. And in the end, Arise Arjuna doesn't give you a nice, tidy answer. Instead, it leaves the reader with the exact same question it starts with, posing it as the central challenge for this new century. In the face of this modern Kurukshetra, will Arjuna arise